Hey everyone, it's Brittany Callis.
Hey, don't write yourself off yet.
Hey everyone, it's Playball 114.
Look down on.
Hey everyone, it's
Try your best.
No!
Everything you can. And don't you worry what they tell themselves when you're away. It just takes some time, little girl in a little house.
Which we call the Holocaust. In Hebrew, we simply call it Shoah, which means a catastrophe. Because 6 million Jews were murdered, including 1.5 million children. The Nazis knew that if you kill the children, you kill an entire people. And these were children whose lives were taken away, whose talents have been lost to the world, whose wings were never allowed to spread. It started with words. Words can be very toxic. I still cannot understand the hate that brought this about. I can simply think Jews were such a small number of people in continental Europe. This picture that you see in front of you, some 400 million people were living here, and amongst them were 11 million Jewish people, 11 million, dispersed in many different countries. The large number of Jewish people lived in Poland, 3.5 million, in the Soviet Union, about 5 million, and the rest of us were spread out here, Spain, England, North Africa, and so on. There was simply no room for 11 million Jews. And you know, Jews were contributors to cultural and economic life. They were builders, they were thinkers, they were professors, they were conductors, rich, middle class, poor. They were very good citizens in every one of those countries. I guess our problem was that we were very small in number. We were sort of used as a kicking post from all the way back for 2,000 years. Jews did not have a very easy time in Europe. In fact, Jews were only emancipated, which means that they were allowed to take citizenship in these countries where they lived in the 1800s under Napoleon Bonaparte. So perhaps this is one of the things. I just have to tell you a meeting that I had with a Roman Catholic priest who was in Toronto last fall. His name is Father Patrick Debois. He's a French priest whose grandfather was taken as a prisoner during the Second World War and taken to occupied Russia, somewhere over here. And when he came back after the war, Patrick was a young boy, and he said, "Father, where were you?" He said, "I was in a place called Rabaruska." He said, "Where is this place? What is this place?" He says, "You know, it is in the Ukraine, but I cannot tell you anything more about it. It is a terrible place." And his grandfather never told him what this place was. So as he grew up, he really wanted to find out what this was, and all of a sudden he came face to face with the Holocaust. He went to university, and he was determined to really dwell into this. And he went to Jerusalem, he went to university there, he learned Hebrew, and he worked at Yad Vashem, which means each had a name. This is where the archives are kept of all the destroyed communities and people. And he was determined to go to this place called Rabaruska. And he even wrote a book, and I recommend that you read it. The title is Holocaust by Bullets. And you saw a frame here, SS officers or men, soldiers, As you heard before, they were volunteers who were slaughtering men, women, and children in pits and in ravines in the Ukraine, in White Russia, Ossetia, and Transnistria. There were a few thousand people in the synagogue. You could hear a pin drop. And he started his speech with the following words. He quoted from the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. If you read the Old Testament or the New Testament, you probably know the story. Cain and Abel were working out in the field, and Cain rose up and slew his brother Abel. God calls to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Imagine, am I my brother's keeper? Remember this. And Father Patrick Dubois says, by the way, he spent 7 years in the Ukraine to search for mass graves of the remains of people. These are skulls and bones. And he found mass graves of 1.5 million people. 7 years of his life. And he's going back again with a group of interpreters because he is certain that there are another 500,000 graves that have not been found. And he says why he is doing this. Because he feels this duty that he is his brother's keeper. And he said that a war is never finished until every soldier is accounted for. And the Holocaust will never be finished until each mass grave is found and the remains are buried as normal human beings should be buried. So therefore, I'm standing here in front of you and I say that I will speak to groups of people, and I've been a speaker for 20 years. As long as there are deniers, as long as there are anti-Semites in the world. Because racism is not only bad for the Jews, it is bad for the entire society that starts it. So remember words, and I'm sure that in your schools, I hope that you don't have bullying. Think about it, how it starts. Once you put this word out, you can never take it back. In all these conflicts, there is a perpetrator, whether it's in bullying or in this instance in Europe, in Nazi Germany, the perpetrators who began, and they're willing collaborators. And then there's a large majority of silent bystanders who did not get involved. They just stood by and watched things happen. And bad things happen when there are bystanders. But there were people who we call the righteous among the nation. People, individuals who stood up and they saved the Jewish people. They hid them. And they were in great danger of doing this because a Jewish life in continental Europe was not worth a plug nickel in those days. Can you imagine living in an environment such as that? You cannot leave and nobody wants to take you in. So you see numbers in other countries, and those are numbers of Jews that were deported as the Nazis occupied the different countries. And once they were finished with these 2 million Jews in the East, you know, there was an order by the Reichsführer of the SS, Himmler, and the order was that 1 bullet, 1 Jew, 1 Jew, 1 bullet. You remember you saw a mother with a baby in her arm. They only shot her with a bullet and she took the baby with her into the ditch. Then they turned their attention to Central and Western Europe. And there the Holocaust began in occupied Poland. It was the first country that was occupied by Nazi Germany. And this is where the death camps were established. And Jews were carted from all points in Europe to occupy Poland. Of course, there were many camps in Germany as well. Buchenwald, Dachau. These were in operation in the 30s. And you also heard that they had to follow orders. Well, you know, there was a little country in Europe, even though they were occupied, they managed to save every single one of their Jewish neighbors who were Danish, but they happened to be of the Jewish faith. This was Denmark. They took the Jews from the south, from the cities to the fishing villages in the north. They stuffed them into little fishing dories, and they took them over to Denmark, straight to Sweden, where they spent 3 years. And when the war was finished, these Jews came back from Sweden to their homes. I want you to remember this. Their neighbors took care of their homes. Not a single person moved into a Jewish home. There was coffee and cake to greet them when they came back. In many cases, their back pay was there. So you see, to say that we followed orders, that is a big lie. And you might want to read a book, which is a very interesting book. It's called The Rosenstrasse Women in Berlin. Rosenstrasse, rose means rose, Rosen. These were women whose husbands, these were German, Aryan women, whose husbands were Jews, who were arrested, of course, and they were working in factories somewhere. And finally, in 43, I believe it was, they were being assembled in a building, and they were going to be shipped out east. And these women, by the thousands, they came out on Rosenstrasse, and they stood their ground for days and nights for about a week. And they would not move away, and finally, their husbands were let out. This was in 1943. Isn't that amazing? So you need to remember, when anybody says that I followed orders and committed terrible massacres, he's coughing out. So here's another map of continental Europe, and I just want to show you, for instance, Hungary and Czechoslovakia. This was at one time called Austro-Hungarian Empire before the First World War, and I come from this area, Czechoslovakia over here. And here in Czechoslovakia or in Hungary, we Jews have lived for 1,900 years. We were no latecomers. You see, the Europeans came to Canada about 500 years ago. Do you feel that you don't belong here? Well, we lived in Hungary for 1,900 years. We were there when the Romans were there. In fact, we have records in Budapest in the museum. Jews were there as artisans, tradespeople, and whatever. The Magyars came from Mongolia, from here, this area somewhere, in the year 900 to this place, and when they arrived here, it was called Hungary because it was called the Ugor tribes.